Did you know that each letter of the English alphabet has its own intriguing origin story? There are snakes and eyes and weapons, and 5 of these letters actually used to all be the same letter. What were those Greeks thinking? If you think you already knew some of these stories, well, you have 26 chances to be right. Are you ready? The letter A used to be upside down, or was it sideways? And it didn't say A, it was more like butter. It comes from the Phoenician letter Aleph, and it looked like the head of an ox with horns. Can you see that now? But the Phoenician alphabet didn't have vowels, so the Greeks turned it into the vowel alpha. B began 4,000 years ago as a picture of a house in Egyptian hieroglyphics, a bird's eye view representing shelter. The Semitic word for house is bet, and it looked like the house kept flipping over until it got comfy. Letter C has been sharp and it's been round, but what is its sound? It wasn't just English that couldn't decide. See, the Greeks used it for a different sound altogether. In fact, C used to be the exact same letter as another one. See if you can guess it before it comes up. D, the door, may have originally been a fish. There are many different Egyptian hieroglyphs for this one, perhaps the open flap of a tent. Anyway, the Phoenicians used it as a door and the Greeks turned it into delta. Then the Romans flipped it and called it D. Letter E started as a happy stick figure man with his arms up, and it meant joy to the Egyptians. Later in time, it probably meant window, but wait for this. It used to be called hair and had the sound of H, but the Greeks flipped it for easier writing and changed the pronunciation to an E sound. Okay, ready for a dangerous letter? F once looked like a Y and sounded like wow, which came from a mace in Egyptian and a hook in Phoenician. What's a mace? This is a mace. Bad weapon, that. See, the Greeks tipped it over, a lot of tipping over going on here with the alphabet, and they called it D gamma because it looked like gamma with an extra line. What's a gamma? Well, it's the one after F, of course. As for the sound, it was the Romans who changed it to F. Oh, and F is one of the famous 5 who all came from the same letter. Any guesses what the other 4 are that came from that same letter? Write your guesses in the comments to let me know. And then when you're done, click these 3 buttons. I would really appreciate it because it tells me you like the video and I'll make more like this. So gamma is G, but what does it mean? Well, at first it was a boomerang or a throwing stick, but it meant camel in Phoenician. It always had a G sound, thus gamma in Greek, and it kicked the Greek letter zeta to the end of the alphabet. Crazy times. And the Romans? Well, they used it for both G and K sounds, except it looked like a C. Wait, that doesn't work, does it? So letter G had to get some boots. Next is the letter H, and H was a fence that made a throaty, breathy sound. Now, the ancient Greeks did have an H sound at first, but later they lost the sound. So they said, we don't need this letter, and they dropped poor old H. Well, it's been lost and found quite a few times since then, even in English, and that should tell you why H is sometimes pronounced and sometimes not. By the way, guys, just remember that all of these letters came on very long journeys, so there are a few opposing origin stories, and some are much more complicated than this. I'm just giving you the whirlwind version here, okay? We good? In 1000 BC, the letter I was called Yod and sounded like Y in yes. It was a leg and a hand, but later it changed to an arm and a hand. Then the Greeks called it iota and made a vertical squiggle till 700 BC when it turned into a boring old straight line. But I had a little sister. Letter J, well, this one is completely different. It is the baby of the alphabet, the last letter we got, in fact, and no ancient people involved. See, in the early days, no one needed the sound of J. It wasn't Julius Caesar, it was
Julius.
And it actually started out as no more than a fancy flourish that you'd write when there were 2 I's in a row. Thank goodness this guy created the lovely loopy J. As for K, well, K started out as a hand minus a few fingers. In Semitic, it was called kaf, which meant the palm of the hand. When the Greeks adopted it in 800 BC, it became kappa, and altogether now, it flipped to the right. Now, L has always been called L, and to the Egyptians, it was the leg of their god Osiris. And it changed direction many times. It was upside down and looked like a hook, and then reversed and turned into a cattle prod. The Greeks faced it right and straightened it a bit, and the Romans, well, you know the rest. M is awesome. M used to look like wavy water because it was water, and there were 5 or 6 waves, not 2. In 1800 BC, the ancient Semites reduced it to 3 waves, and then the Phoenicians calmed that sea to only 2 waves, and eventually the peaks became zigzags, and the rest is history. Letter N started life as a snake, maybe a cobra. This was Egypt after all. The Semites turned it into a fish called nun, and in 1000 BC, the Greeks named it Nu. Still looks like a little slimy snake to me. Does it get weirder than a snake? Well, listen to this one. O began as an I. No, an actual I. It had a deep, throaty sound back then. The Phoenicians reduced the hieroglyphics to only the pupil of the eye. Can you see it? Actually, the Greeks rather liked this one and used it to make another variation for the end of their alphabet. Anyone know what that letter is? Tell us in the comments, but no cheating, no Google over there, okay? The letter P is a bit of a mystery. See, the hieroglyph looks like a mouth, and it stayed like that until 1000 BC, when it became an inverted V shape. Was it still a mouth? Well, its name still meant mouth. The Greeks turned it into something familiar, pi. How's your maths? But on the Greek island of Thera, it became rounder, and finally the Romans, well, they flipped it to the right and they closed the loop. Now, what about Q? Q is the exotic one that only shows up once every 510 letters in English, but the meaning? It was a needle, a knot, or a monkey with a tail. I know, not at all confusing. See, it started as a throaty K sound, and then Latin gave Q a curly tail to make it super cool. And if you wonder where Q got its U, well, that's a romance story. What's next? It is R, of course. In Egypt, letter R was a human head in profile, facing left, and pronounced resh. Resh meant head. The weird thing is that in hieroglyphics, R was also a mouth, like P, but they're not related. Those Egyptians were just complicated. Anyway, the Greeks added a little tail and flipped it to make left to right writing easier. Then the Romans, here they come again, turned the tail into a leg and gave it a trilled sound. Now, S. S is the coolest sibling of W. I know, weird.
Yeah, weird.
It started off as a horizontal wavy W that made a sh sound. And the very early S's may have been the bow of an archer. However, in Phoenician, it meant tooth. But Greek didn't have a sh sound, so they made it vertical and named it sigma. And then the Romans made it curvy. Fun fact, in some Italic alphabets, you could write an S in up to 6 zigzagging strokes if you wanted to. The Phoenician letter T looked like our lowercase t. Back then, it was used only as a mark for illiterate people who couldn't sign their own names. Centuries later, the Greeks added the cross at the top to distinguish it from an X. And what was X? Well, we are nearly there. The letter U initially looked like a Y in 1000 BC. Wait, where have we seen this before? Well, here come the 5 siblings. This letter had the same beginnings as F, V, W, and Y. The Etruscans and Romans preferred this shape for letter V. But in Latin, V was a vowel that sounded like U, and it took French and Italian to give the V sound that we know. Okay, so how is W different then? Well, when the Anglo-Saxons came, they used this letter from the old runic alphabet of the Vikings, which meant joy. Later on, Charlemagne's scribes wrote it as 2 U's side by side, and eventually this double U symbol became W. X was a fish in Phoenician, and back then it had a hard S sound. In 900 BC, its Greek name changed to more of a Scottish ch, as in loch, but in Latin, the sound was different. So the Romans took the X sound from another alphabet and combined it with the Greek symbol, and X was born. The shape of the Latin letter Y comes from the Greek letter upsilon. This was in 100 BC, and it got a little foot to distinguish it. And finally, we are at Z. So what do you think Z was? Well, the Phoenicians had a letter that meant an axe or a sword, which looked like a capital I. The Greeks named it Zeta and gave the Z sound, but nobody needed it for centuries. Allegedly, the Romans removed it from the alphabet because apparently, quote, looked like the tongue of a corpse. So it wasn't even used until the Norman French came along with strange words that needed the sound of Z. So guys, how many did you get right? How many did you already know? Let me know in the comments. And if you're looking for another fun linguistic challenge, head on over to this video right here.